going to go. And the big question that came up that we sort of wanted to wrestle with is, what is data? So one of you want to take the first question of what is data and who needs it?
We are data. I think that's what we were saying.
That was the conclusion.
Right? Yeah, that was the conclusion. I'll jump right to the end. So no, I think data is everywhere and you're always using data, whether you know it or not. And so being able to harness that and use it for good, whether it's the good of the company or the good of the humanity, I think is the trick, right? And so that's the strategy part of it.
For me, data is the history of what's happened for your business, right? It is, it's the past. It is not representative of the future, but a lot of people tend to think it is, and it's not necessarily like the final metrics, the final KPIs that you're looking at. It's all the stuff that goes into building those, and you got to make sure you have it.
Yeah, I guess I would say, I think there's a lot of information in the world. We're all swimming in that, whether in our personal lives or in our work lives. I think data is about how you use information and filter it in a way to express an opinion about the world. And I think there's a lot of different ways of doing that, but data is something you actively create and it serves a purpose.
Yeah, so startups, you're building interactive products. The result of those products is going to be data, and all of your customer interactions, even your user interactions, even your QA interactions, it's all valuable data that can come in. And it is the lifeblood of the ultimate company that you're building. And so we have this data. We want to manage the data. We want to work with it and make it useful, because without it, you're building a product. It's an open loop design. So what do you guys think about the how, the who, the why, the what of managing data? Where do you start as a product in terms of building something that you want to be scalable, maintainable? As a startup, not everybody is going to need an instant. I'm going to hold 50 terabytes worth of data.
Yeah.
So where would you guys think about starting with building data pipelines, scalable data pipelines to become a little bit more actionable? And ultimately, where do you see those tools developing as part of the startup software development lifecycle?
I think you hit the nail on the head with it changes, right? Like there is no one data management solution that will fit everybody, right? And something that you need when you're an E-round startup with exabytes of data is not going to work when you are an A-round startup, and that's not necessary, right? Like it's overkill at that stage. So really looking at what you're trying to do with data is the key, right? Like what is the business use case that you're trying to fulfill with that data? And then understanding how you get data there. So you said pipeline, and I always think of it as a pipeline, like the life cycle of that data, and what does it mean that you will be moving data around for a specific purpose. And so there's lots of different theories about, academic theories even about how to manage data, whether it's like a data fabric or a data mesh. And I think that each of those has its place, but maybe not your place, depending on what you're doing. So really focusing on the business need is always the trick for me.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Colleen. Like you got to start with understanding what you care about, and then that should drive the answers to the questions. Like if you're storing backend data for a website, that might be really different than if you're running a retail business, and the solution you come up with for what you care about in those two cases could be really quite different.
I would also add that you gotta communicate whatever strategy for capturing that data is to all of your people and make sure everyone's on board. I haven't been in any very small startups, but I know as startups get bigger, they tend to get a lot of people. A lot of people have new ideas, new ways of doing things. And if you get too many people running off in too many different directions, you end up with data silos. And that can really undercut any good data strategy that you might have had at the beginning.
So I guess to put a finer point on it, how do you ensure that the data that you're collecting matches the business goals or the goals of the business and matches, that you build that data pipeline? Sort of the how Is there a way that any advice that you could offer a startup for how you kind of get that process right in the beginning?
So I've done some advising, and I've been asked a lot, like, who should our first data hire be? Because often, like, the way startups work, you have like a software engineer who's also working on data engineering in their spare time, and they're like, should we hire a data scientist? And sorry, Zach, sorry, Andrew, but I would say no. I would say you should start by hiring a data engineer at first, right? Like someone who's focusing on those pipelines and understanding what data you even have. Because I guarantee most businesses don't know what data they have, right? So really, understanding and discovering the data that you're collecting and making sure you understand how to bring it together in a way that makes sense for your business. And then you can go get the data scientists, get the analysts working on it.
Those data scientists will be a lot happier if you
So
hired
pesky.
a data engineer before you hire them.
Yeah.
Like if they can go talk to someone about, hey, where's the data live? What's the schema? And there's a person who will answer those questions and make their lives a lot better.
Yeah. Otherwise, they'll just end up being your data engineer.
Yeah,
Right. When they
exactly.
start the company, they'll have to, and I have had to play that role in my profession where, someone just wanted a data guy, and I can do that,
Mhm.
but it wasn't exactly what I thought I was going to do.
Yeah.
It's like we got a question.
Everything.
Apologies. I don't know if you're open to questions, but I had something. Thank you. Okay, so as somebody who's been through multiple startup experiences, working in back end and also working on data, one thing that occurs to me is we talk about data as if we assume it exists, but actually somebody has to put in the thought to say, this is an important event that has occurred, and I need to make a recording of it, and that should not be taken for granted. And I found that one of my recent startup experiences, the hardest part was communicating to the developers. Okay, how do you know that something important has happened that you must record? So, as for me, because I do have perspectives in analysis and also in backend server development, it was easy for me to put that together, but very difficult for me to communicate to other developers who don't have those shared experiences. So I was wondering if panel could share some of their insights about how to communicate best practices for data generation in a back-end or even in a front-end development setting.
So I think in one of our other conversations, one of you said that you were working with a CTO, and the most important thing that they did was create the schema for the database.
Yeah.
That was you.
That's actually Topher who I was talking about. But yeah, it starts at the top. You got to understand what you care about, and you have to communicate that to your team. And if your technical leadership has a very clear idea about what you are doing as a business, what's the data you're collecting, and what's the purpose it serves, and they can communicate that to the individual developers, that makes it a lot easier. And in the case of me, when I was working with Toph, he had a very clear understanding of the data we needed to run that business and how he wanted to store it in a way that would power the applications he was writing. And as a data scientist, that made it very clear to me, what I was doing and what I needed to pay attention to, because it was right there in the way the database was structured.
Yeah, my general advice is more is always better with data, but within reason, because
Yeah.
you don't want to capture clickstream if you don't need it, right? Like if you're not going to use it. But again, it gets back to like, what are you doing with that data, right? Like there's no point in having any data engineering and data pipelines if you're not doing something with it. So always like start with the business value you foresee happening with the data, and then pull it back and work backwards into what you need to collect. But there's also, for most apps, there's like standard things to collect too. So
Yeah. And it is always a lot easier to scale back your data collection than to scale it up, right? I'd rather have 3 days worth of a whole bunch of data than that I can just see what it looks like and be like, hey, let's collect more of this and this and this than, nothing.
Yeah.
Right. Err on, collecting more data, and make sure that those engineers that are generating the data have a good place to put it in. And a flexible way to store it, right? Because if you make everyone, not to go counter to Zach, but if you make everyone follow the same schema
Yeah.
and you have, dynamic use cases, people are going to come up with different ways to hack your schema.
Yeah.
So you got to make it a little bit flexible too.
Also,
Somebody has-
like, I can't help but chuckle a little when the data scientist is like, more data.
Yeah.
It's kind of on brand for
Shocking.
you.
Yeah.
No, but I think you need to be flexible too, and you need to be very agile so that you can shift how much you're collecting, what you're collecting to over time, because your business use cases are going to change too.
So what kind of sort of KPIs or metrics do you guys usually think about gathering when you're creating these how do you figure out what data is worth keeping?
I think in order to understand that, you have to understand what defines good. So
Okay, fair.
define what good data looks like and what data you need to solve that business case. And then, when you do that, then you should have like a data-driven KPI for like, how do you define that? Like, is there a certain number of, there's a ton of different metrics you can use for data quality, but
So you've got the business metrics,
yeah.
what have you, sales or and then do you want to correlate that? I imagine you want to correlate that with the data
Yeah.
that you're gathering, and
Yeah.
that's the worthwhile data. So first you've got your data engineers build your pipeline, and then you
Yeah.
have your data scientists who can parse the data and reflect on how that impacts the business metrics too.
Yeah.
Any thoughts of good tools that startups can start with, and then what the sort of tool evolution, how you design schemas and structures so that they can move, adopt different tools as their needs grow, or think about costs.
On KPIs, I just wanted to say, I think it's also
Yeah.
important to not just ask your data scientists, but also ask your business people, like, okay, the business metrics, what do you care about within that? What should we be measuring? What should we be tracking? I've worked so many places where there's a million metrics in the back end, and not one of them is the single thing that the sales team cares about the most, because nobody's gone and actually talked to them about it. And so you get, the back end of the house measuring one thing, and the front of the house cares about something else. So there's really there's no workaround for talking to your people, particularly your expert people who are good at what they do, and understanding what their needs are and making sure that your data strategy is serving those needs. At an early stage startup, that's usually the CEO is a person who says, where's my Friday morning sales report? What is in it? It's not the things I care about. But over time, you get more people who need that information, and you need to make sure you're getting it in front of them in a form they can use.
Yeah. Before we move on to the next one, I would also add that, like, KPIs, I can talk a little bit about project specific KPIs. And the most important thing for me is picking something that is measurable quickly, right? You don't want to have a KPI that you get every quarter. And if you do have that, and that is an important business metric, you want to find a proxy for it, or several proxies for it, that you can measure rapidly, and everyone in the company needs to agree on what those things are and why we like them as proxies, right? Just 2 cents on KPIs there. And what was the topic we were supposed to be on?
Well, data strategy.
Tech stack.
Tech stack.
Yeah,
Okay.
tech stack. So within that framework, any thoughts about sort of governance and security within the data?
Nah.
Nah,
Don't need it.
don't need it. That's good.
Super close.
I think with governance, probably never actually too early to start on that. Like a lot of startups I've worked at, everyone has access to everything. And then you have some new analyst who starts and drops the production database by mistake. And then you realize that, not only should not everyone have access to everything, but people don't want access to everything. I've worked places where I've said, no, take away my access. I don't want to be able to access that database. Give me the analytics database, not production. So I think that's important. Like, think at least a little bit about separating what's running your application from your analytics data. Maybe those live in different places. And people shouldn't want access to things they don't need because that gets them into trouble that they don't want to have.
Yeah, particularly private information about potential customers. That's one that I've seen be difficult to separate from, like, you're just collecting it all, and then you realize, oh, this one thing here, maybe everyone in the company shouldn't, have a GPS coordinate on a customer, right?
Yeah.
That's not a good idea.
Wait, what company was that?
I'm not going to talk about that. But yeah, so make sure you think about how to separate those things. If you're early stage, maybe it's, everyone in the company is trustable, but as you grow,
I would.
Have you met early stage people?
No one is trustable. Don't trust anyone.
Resource-based access control is
But I mean, again, I'm not trustable. Like, I've done dumb things, and I've been like, oh, well, I'm glad I'm in the sandbox where no one cares what I do. Like, this is why I turned down the SSH keys when someone gave them to me on my first day. Like, I don't want to be able to do that because I know I'm going to make a mistake.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think, as you get bigger, so those of us who have been bigger companies have seen this a lot, but as you get bigger, and then as you work with more regulated industries, you need to have an answer for things like zero trust, right? So like principle of least privilege everywhere, right? Auditability everywhere. And so you don't need that day one, but you need to build something that can be extended to that. And so it's harder to take away privilege than it is to grant it. Yeah.
I think regarding a data strategy, building that data strategy, and starting with governance from the get-go is going to make it much easier when you go for your next round of funding and you have people coming in doing their due diligence to sort of say, no, look, here's our report on who's got access to what, and it's
do maintain, it is a balance though, because if you restrict freedom of access, and you can slow down your pace of innovation too. So it's a careful.
Yeah. Chloe.
Can we get the microphone?
Good afternoon, Shazab Lada, founder of Forte Investment Fund. Question, it's more of a reflection. As I was looking at our data strategy and what we need to collect, and I started to segment the different audiences, regulatory bodies, our investors, our clients, it suddenly became overwhelming, right? But then I had to take it down to binary and say, look, this is a journey, not a destination. So we really need to start with what we need immediately versus what we may need down the road in terms of our sales metrics and how complicated they need to be. And so it's kind of a very big behemoth. And for you, one of the things that I fell into was really being overwhelmed with the different data elements that I did need to collect versus articulating what's the journey we're going to be on and what's the infrastructure we need to have in order for us to be able to monetize / utilize efficiently the appropriate data at the appropriate times. Any thoughts on that reflection?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say, early stage, you're overwhelmed by everything, not just data, right? So you need to be thinking about just what are the key metrics and keep it simple as much as you can. But, later on, you're going to have data engineers and data scientists and people like that, but you're not going to have those early on. So you need to really build for that future and say, well, we'll table that for now, and we don't need that today. So yeah, it can be overwhelming though. Absolutely. Especially the governance piece of it. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think just to echo Andrew's thought, your sort of business processes need to match the data collection side of things, and so there's clearly stuff that if your investors won't need to know about what your salespeople do need to know about, and that's a pretty it's easier to segment that into where the information flows and who needs what. And when I was CTO of a small startup, we actually had a business process flow that we had. This is where the information comes from with this flow, and this is what it gets used to. And it was this sort of hard thing to create, but we eventually had this nice flow chart that really helped clarify what data needed to be in the schema. And that was sort of really useful. And it was one of those things that pops into your head at 2:00 in the morning.
Lots of questions.
Yeah, microphone.
Hi, Nishant here. So one of the things that puzzles me often is you have your data strategy and you have bringing in your data. Now you have to work on your tech stack. And at what point it makes sense to bring in external vendor when you are in an early stage for your data solutions compared to maintaining them in-house? And vendor could be like, like hyperscalers or some of those Databricks, Snowflakes kind of vendors. So just insight on like, is there any downside or plus side when bringing these kind of vendors for your data solutions early in the startup?
That's a great segue into tools and cost and value.
So for early stage companies, I actually think buying solutions can be a better idea than building them if you're very careful about what you're doing. But when you have a small team and not a lot of time, you need to make sure your people are focused on what they do the best. And I'm a big believer in outsourcing things that aren't core to your mission to other people who you can just pay to solve a problem for you.
Yeah, and I think that further to that, you need to choose tools that are flexible and leave you with a lot of options, because every vendor out there, including the ones that we may have worked for or work for now, is going to try to be sticky.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to try to lock you in, and that's how they make money. And you just go in with eyes open on that and understand that sometimes that's okay, but you don't want to sign a 3-year deal with some data warehouse or hyperscaler or whatever it is if you're not sure that that's your 3-year strategy. Right.
And you don't want to be in a position where you've had some success and now the bill is coming due and you're vendor locked like crazy, right? So I'm a big fan of vendors that are based around some kind of open source foundation that can be unwound with enough engineering effort, right? Where you can be like, oh, if I dedicate the engineers to this down the road, I can unwind this vendor lock, or I can move this data somewhere else. Make sure you have that core of like, yes, the data still also lives in S3, just raw, doesn't only live in Snowflake.
Yeah, that's literally what I was about to say. It's like,
Are we all thinking of Snowflake?
If you store your raw data somewhere cheap, like S3, and because you can just shove it in there and keep it forever and it doesn't cost a lot. And then in the future, that can make it a lot easier to say, hey, we're actually going to load this somewhere else than where we've been keeping it. Or, there's something that we should have been tracking that we weren't. And you can go back and get that out of all your raw logs that you've kept around.
Yeah.
Well, and there's also, you don't even need a data warehouse. You just query S3 directly.
Yeah,
So
that works too.
I would say that's even more straightforward. So
You guys also had particular thoughts about SQL versus non-SQL. Some of you had particular.
I have a lot of feelings about this and other things, but SQL is the lingua franca of data, right? Like everybody should know SQL, and NoSQL databases, there is probably a time and place for them, but I think for the most part, the SQL database is the way to go. But
NoSQL for me is like I think it has its place, and I think that place is usually when it's like directly attached to an application.
Yeah.
Right. The most successful applications I've seen are always, a feature store, right, is one place for it, where you feed this data in real time for a model that I'm serving. It's a great use case. Another use case, is we had a genealogy tool at Tesla that we built on NoSQL, and it was fantastic. The problem came when people wanted to do massive queries against it. So anytime you need to do a massive query and you're looking at NoSQL, it's not going to work, right? It's one request, one response kind of thing.
And that's why I'm a big believer in like separating your prod database and your analytics database, because then you can make decisions like, hey, for the production application here, we need something very closely tied technically to the needs of the application. But then you're writing back that data to an analytics database somewhere where your analysts can run SQL, which is the language they all speak for, give me monthly sales through the past year in North America. And someone can go do that very easily.
You had a question?
Hi, I'm Emma Boris, and I'm a data strategy consultant for female founders. And as I've been building up my consultancy, I've found that particularly with early stage, and I think you're going to get to this shortly about the value of data. I found that founders aren't really as open to thinking that data is valuable or that someone like me is valuable, whereas someone, in a Series B, let's say, they may already have a full data team and may also not recognize the value of getting someone in early. So I'm wondering, when you were talking about who should your first data hire be, have you found that there are industries or founding levels that are sort of more open to accepting that data is very, very valuable in a startup?
I think it depends on the startup, because there's some startups that are going to be technically complex and they're worried more about the app than anything. They're trying to pivot, find product market fit. Like, that's their goal. There's other startups that they have a solid idea, they know what they're doing, and maybe they have that freedom to worry less about the product itself and worry more about building the company, which means they're more prepared for that data. But early stage, they're never going to be like what I would call data mature, right? So trying to help them see that they want to get there is important, but it's hard. It's really hard to convince people to pull in data early because it's not a direct revenue driver in most cases, but you need to look for the businesses where it would be, is my take on it.
My thought on that is, so everyone wants an AI strategy. Every company wants to put AI somewhere in so that they can go raise more money. And I always start any conversation with someone who says, all right, we want AI in our product, with what's the data you have that's unique? Because if you don't have any information that's not out in the training set of GPT-4, you don't really need an AI strategy. You can just use ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, like everybody else. And so that's the angle I like to use, is if you want to build something differentiated in AI, you need to have data that everyone else doesn't have, and you need to be actively creating and curating that. And on the other hand, if you don't want differentiated AI, and that's fine, and a lot of people don't, then great, you don't have to worry about that. But that can be an angle in with if you're thinking about AI, step one is thinking about your data.
Yeah, I echo that one, and I think that the problem you're encountering is going to get better with the advent of more Gen AI, because more people are thinking about it. More people are like, oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Okay. I gotta lean into this microphone. This works from way back there. More people are leaning into it. More people are thinking about Gen AI, and even at mature companies, I've talked to colleagues who are at big companies that have data teams that thought they were well recognized by their executives, and all of a sudden they're like, "Wow, I'm getting a lot of attention right now." And boy, all of our problems are getting fixed in our data strategy because we are complaining about them and people are finally hearing us. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that one.
I think the earlier comment was save everything in S3.
Yeah.
It's cheap. You can analyze it later. You can bring it forward, and that's a nice sort of little staging area that you'll always have. And it's really cheap. And you can bring it into your tools. In our earlier conversations, if you've got security concerns, you can rebuild the data through events, an event store that watches for particular things, and you can solve your ETL problems with by using vendor Snowflake issues. Not that I'm talking about any particular vendor, including my business's nemesis, but to be utterly frank. But that's just in the cloud, all these things are cheap, and you're renting them rather than buying them. So it's a good way to start.
I think that does end up being the MVP data strategy for most people, is S3 or ADLS or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But it's definitely an MVP.
It's slow, but it works.
It's slow, but it's there. At least it's there.
Yeah. I think we have.
Hi, Adam Eichmann. So I'm curious, when you're talking about, okay, we're using S3, we're using DynamoDB at the low level. What are your thoughts on just sort of, for small startups, sort of the buy versus build of the layer on top of that? I mean, I've been coding stuff in Python against S3 and DynamoDB because I can and all that sort of stuff. But is there, without going to a vendor and trying to get them to do it, do you find that there are, low-level technologies on top of that that are more useful or efficient to be using rather than coding directly against, those low-level APIs?
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of SQL. If you can get your database, there's tons of them. There's open source, there's vendor providers. You can take your pick of anything. But if you want your data science or analytics team or people who can't necessarily code in Python, although more and more people can, and it's getting easier and easier to write code. And so that maybe is less and less of a consideration, but SQL is definitely a great tool for making your data legible to many different people and many different parts of your business. And if you can get your data somewhere where it's easy to query with SQL, that is one easy way to make it lower cost for people to get information out of a data store.
And I think there's the idea of a semantic layer too going in there. Like, I mean, there are a lot of products out there that will build you a semantic layer or, kind of function as a catalog. But I think at the lowest level, like thinking of your data as a product and defining what your golden data sets are, what your data products are is really important. And you can use tools like Trino too. So you don't even need a database. You can just, consolidate across sources. So that's always an option. And that's open source. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of, immediately my thought is, I write Spark against S3, right? That's not the most accessible first layer to go for, because if you're building it yourself, it can be challenging. And if you're buying it, it can be expensive. But it can give you pretty good direct access to data that just sits in S3 pretty flexibly. And if you're able to code in Python or code in PySpark, I listened to a talk this morning about AI tools, and I find what they're really good at is taking something that someone writes in Pandas or in SQL and giving you a Spark layer for it. Super useful use case for ChatGPT, in my opinion.
Or telling you where you got a keyword wrong and you can't figure out why it's not
too.
working.
That's a good one too. Yeah.
And Tabular and Presto. You just really don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
The Tabular is Databricks now, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, what was the first one you said there?
Tabular.
Oh yeah.
Iceberg.
Yeah.
So success in using data and AI, I think we can move on to that. We've sort of walked in. How do you take your data strategy and now you've got your data and now your next investor or your CEO comes and says like, okay, AI is the best thing since sliced bread, which you learned last week, and we have to do something with it. So what are some goods? How do you try to build in success into your strategy for AI and machine learning?
I would say that in my mind, there's sort of two things that you need there. One is AI is only going to be as good as the data that you have, right? Like you have to have the data to drive the AI. Like I love the way Zach said it, which was, I forget exactly how you said it, but it was something along the lines of, if you don't have unique data, you might as well just use what's already out there. So you need to find what's unique to you and make sure your data is of high enough quality, et cetera. So you need the data. And then with AI, there's also a level of creativity that's needed. You can't just, I hear so many CEOs tell their chief data officers, like, we have to do AI. And it's like, what does that even mean, right? Like, do you want chatbots everywhere? Like, what does that mean? And so, yes, but who doesn't love a chatbot? But, I think you need to, there's a level of creativity that needs to come from the business, not necessarily the data people. The data people can contribute as well, but the business has to have creative ideas about how to use this new technology to answer questions that couldn't have been answered before, right? Or do something better, right? Or automate something or whatever it is. And so I think, like if you've had a data strategy built around BI or traditional / legacy data use cases, and now you're trying to push it to AI, then you're probably more mature in the data department. So it's the creativity that's the lift. Maybe it's the other way around though. And so you sort of have to like evaluate your own data maturity and think about where you are.
Ripping a little on like creativity, the most valuable source of data is going to be anything human generated. And in particular, if you have humans who are expert at something that they're very good at doing in your organization, figuring out how they can express that, perhaps in writing, perhaps in spoken word. But that's one of the things that, to me, as someone who's been doing data science his entire career, that's really exciting about some of the newer AI tools, is it lets you do a lot more with very small data sets of text, which, in traditional statistics, if you had a couple hundred written survey responses, like you couldn't do a whole lot with that other than have someone read them. But there's now some more interesting stuff you can do with data like that. So you
had a couple really good examples.
Yeah. So like, I mean, I used to work with Colleen actually on like survey data. And you'd have like 1,000 question surveys that you could just tell if someone got bored 100 questions and then stopped answering it. And like, you can replace that with like, like the classic survey you'll see people do now is like, did you like our product 1 to 10? And then tell us why. And the text box lets the human say whatever they want to say to you. And then now, at scale, even if you got 1 million of those responses, you can still figure out like, what are the common themes in that text data. And you don't even need a chat bot to do that, but you could use some of those tools to help you understand that if you wanted to.
Yeah. It's gotten way easier to do that. It used to be so difficult. I would, to the, kind of more to the aspiring data scientist in the crowd, but along lines of what Colleen said about getting product invested in like doing something really cool with AI, that is very important. And, we as data people also need to think about, the V in MVP, like what is viable now? Because 2 years ago, that had a whole different meaning. Now you cannot, you can do a whole lot more, and B, you cannot come with a solution that is good but overly simple, right? You come at someone and say, yeah, I solved this problem with a simple moving average. It's a great forecast, right? If I use something complicated, it only gets me 5% better. So let's do the simple thing. That used to be very viable. It's still technically a good strategy. It is much less marketable in this day and age. Like, you need to have there needs to be a better hook. And that's kind of the downside of what you're seeing is the simpler solutions are getting less attention, in my opinion, for better or for worse.
Yeah, that wasn't a thing with BI, right? Like, that's new.
Yeah.
The creativity of like being like, okay, everybody needs to think about this now. It's like, oh, what?
There's the potential that AI can actually be a markedly better solution.
Yeah.
Because we can now use the data and we can find new correlations within the data that weren't possible before. But there's also the other side of like, do we trust it? And so having the data to reproduce, if you've got human data and it's labeled human data, that's the most valuable data that you can have. It's like, okay, we know these people. This is what they were looking at. These are the sort of clicks that they went through our site, and this is ultimately what they ended up doing. That's the most valuable data that you can, because it's the path and that you want your customer to follow, and then you've got all the other stuff where it didn't end up in something, and so having a data strategy so that you've got that labeled human unique data that's unique to your business problem, I think is really important. And you got another question.
Thanks, Brian Kinney. First, to the previous questioner, if you were asking about report and visualization builders, Metabase and Superset come to mind as 2 open source tools that might help. But to Andrew's point about people demanding basically that more sophisticated AI goes into your algorithms than just a simple moving average, right? Do you think that's a sort of phase that we're in, that we're going to grow out of after some level of progress through the AI hype curve, or is that just sort of going to be the new normal, where people who ordinarily wouldn't care about implementation details, they insist on having certain technologies embedded into the product design?
I'm really not sure about that specific example, what I will say is I do think it's going to stick around that people want to know more details about the implementation, right? What data is it leveraging, right? Like if like people just expect a certain amount of sophistication, particularly in terms of what data it's leveraging. I think the algorithm side might be a little bit of a phase, but I think if you aren't marketing that your application is using data from this source and this source and this source, and this is how, and this is the proof that it's doing it, you're missing an opportunity to differentiate yourself. And I say that as someone who's working in a big company trying to differentiate from project to project. So, yeah.
I think inverting that a little bit and looking at it from the perspective of like someone I've managed large machine learning and engineering and data teams. I think there's always a certain attraction to complexity. Like it's always more fun to learn something new than it is to repeat something that you've done 1,000 times before. And I've seen that for my whole career. So like, okay, moving averages used to be cool and now they're not, but they're still quite valuable. And I think there's a little bit of like a complexity can be dangerous in engineering because it makes it harder for you to change what you're doing in the future. And at a startup, you're always going to end up changing. And so I think, in the case you just gave of like a simple moving average and something else is only 5% better, but like sometimes a quick, simple and easy solution is not only quicker to get out the door and ship, but also a lot easier to fix when like a year from now, someone's like, hey, why was the forecast off this day? And you're like, oh, well, because sales were really low last week. So it forecasted them to be low this week too. And you're like, oh, well, that makes sense. And do we want to change that or not? And like, you can think about it. So, my solution to that is like, you've got to be good at articulating why you chose the tool you did and why it's the best tool for the job. And if you can do that well, it'll serve you well in both the case where you chose a simple tool and in the case where you did something complicated because you really actually needed to.
Yeah.
Yes.
That kind of question related to what you were saying before about unique data. So I've chatted with people with startups like, oh, I want to do my own like custom AI solution, and going back, like, oh, you have 3 options in your product and you have 10 customers, so you don't really have enough to figure out automatically what they want. You could probably just write a simple logic. So do you have like a thought about what is enough? Like now you have enough unique data that you can start building your own AI solution.
I've never met a data scientist who says there's enough data.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the heuristic I like to use is like, if you've got 100 examples of something, you can maybe do some kind of simple modeling. Like, sure, if you get a dozen examples, like you should just eyeball that. Like as a human, you should be looking at the data anyway. But at some point it's too big to look at it in an Excel spreadsheet or something. So I don't know, my rough heuristic is like, yeah, if you can write out 100 examples, you've got enough to go on. You can write out 1,000 examples. That's probably great. It's interesting because like I run into a lot of cases where people say we don't have any data, so we can't start. And it's like and I'm like, well, you need 100 images of a thing that you're trying to do some object detection on, and it's like you've got a cell phone here. Like give it to your kid and tell them to take 100 pictures. You'll be done in 5 minutes. Like it's easy to generate the data. You have to just know what you actually want.
There was in our earlier discussion, there was a concept of like, at what point is the investment worth it? And if the payback for the solution is going to pay for itself, then it's worth the effort to go ahead and make it. And that was around, is it a sort of a cost center, or is it going to be a profit generator in whatever the solution is? And that you really wanted to try to put all of your energies into things that are going to be more on the profit center side than the cost center side. I think that was Colleen's statement from our earlier discussion.
Sounds like me.
Yeah, worth keeping. Yeah. Any other questions that we want to go over?
There's one back there.
And go up front.
I'm curious about data any solutions you know of, like automated QA, even in prior to AI type times,
Yeah.
we struggle to have like automated QA solutions. Anything you've seen that's worked as far as being able to do QA on your production like website to validate that it is good against a database or some sort of logic?
You mean data QA? Like
Yeah.
queuing the data?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of products out there actually. There's
Selenium comes to mind.
Yeah, well, there's ones that are specific to data. Like I know there's Anomalo, there's Monte Carlo, there's a few others that their data observability is really the category now. It's focused on the idea of like, you have this pipeline of data, you need to be understanding where your data is moving and how it's getting transformed. And you have to define what correct means at each of those stages, right? Because like you have some tolerance for fault, but then you also humans are the ones who know what good means, right? And so there's a few different platforms out there that do that are pretty cool. I don't know if there's any. I mean, there's got to be open source. There's open source everything. So
I definitely trust Colleen more on the data platform side. One other thing to think about is typing, if you haven't done it, can be a real pain. But if you're starting from scratch, like both TypeScript and MyPy, if you are specific about what kind of data a certain thing should be and you don't allow it to be something else, that's a very good way to ensure you've got the data that you want. And it's also a very good way to identify the places where you're not generating the data that you want and you need to go fix a problem with your application.
Yeah. There's a lot of hopefully cool stuff coming out in the future that'll let AI help with that. Test case generation, I still think is, I don't think it's very good yet. Yeah. Like if I look for AI generated test cases to help with my QA, it's a starting place for a QA engineer and for someone writing good tests, but they're still not great.
But like your software developers should be writing tests. Like
if
you're relying on QA to write your tests, you've already got a problem.
Yeah.
We're looking at TestRail right now and sort of seeing how it works.
Well, I know QA people who would violently disagree with that. But,
I mean, it depends on what you're testing. Like your software engineers should be writing unit tests. Your QA people are thinking at a higher level as they should.
I actually had a follow-on to the moving average plus 5% category there, which is really when you're doing your initial development. I mean, you can spend an arbitrary amount of time and money on gathering data and analyzing it and developing algorithms for it. You don't generally know how good you're going to end up being. So when you have a working solution or starting solution and you're trying to figure out how much more time should I tell everyone spending gathering data, coming up with a better algorithm, a better network architecture, whatever, what do you use to make that call as to whether it's worth trying to find if there's another 5% if I spend who knows how much more effort?
I mean, I would start with the 80-20 rule, right? Like, that's good enough, right? And then, the question is like, what's the business value you're going to get out of another 5%, right? Like, are you going to get increased revenue from that? Or is it just a nice to have? And really going back to the business use case of like, what is good enough, right? Because like your data doesn't need to be perfect either, right? Like the data training these LLMs is far from perfect. It's the internet. So if you hadn't heard, so, like perfection, if you're writing perfect code, that's bad, right? So, what is good enough? Yeah. So that's sort of where I would start. I don't know about you guys.
I think that's good advice. And it depends on, it depends on your value. I've seen business cases where 5% is huge and business cases where 5% might be huge, but we don't really know yet. Right. And so, it's always a judgment call on how far you go.
I mean, I think with startups especially, you're always looking for quick wins. And so it's helpful to think about like opportunity cost, like how much more time do we spend fiddling with this thing versus moving on to something else? Heuristically, I like to say, I don't know, work on something for a sprint. And whatever it is, 1 week sprints, 2 week sprints, whatever you do. And if at the end of that time, if like you've got something that's good enough, like great, that probably means it's time to move on. You know, if you're still stuck on it, it's probably also time to move on.
Yeah. And be realistic about what is achievable.
Yeah.
Because if you're starting with a model that's reasonably well developed, getting a 5% lift on that is huge. Is a really, I mean, it's a big lift. It's a lot of work. If you're starting with something that, you know, was really simple and someone, you know, put it together in a couple sprints and, you know, it was just a solution that worked. And, you know, it's a year later and you're like, hey, maybe we can get an extra 5% out of that. Yeah, that might be achievable.
And it depends on scale. In startups, you've got a small scale. Google, there was a researcher at Google that worked on a hashing algorithm, and it improved their hit rate by something like 1%, which managed to save them $5 million a day. So
That's worth it.
That's worth it. But this is Google. They can have a research team. Most startups, you want to work on, you want to hit singles, reliably hit singles, you know, get product market fit, you know, gather the data that you need to sort of, you know, start the flywheel moving. I think the 5% win is great, you know.
Yeah, ad sales and I worked in display ad marketing for a little while, and you know, every percentage point you get could be huge.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Any questions online? No? Okay. Any final words from the speakers? Closing arguments?
I feel like we could talk for hours. I mean,
Yeah. Was there any points on there that we didn't get to, or?
So
final arguments.
yeah.
Trying to think of other stuff we talked about.
Let's see. Horrible data design. How does this happen? Any cautionary tales? That's always fun.
Oof, that's Zach. Zach has bad
Before it.
stories.
Yeah,
Zach
I
and I
mean-
used to work together, and we've seen some stuff.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite, I've seen this a lot, is someone wants to do some kind of machine learning or AI, but they want to gather all of their possible data first before they do anything. And then they show up with, you know, the database join that's like 100,000 columns of data. And then they spend a whole bunch of time and money trying to model that because it's huge and they got to do all this work. And that turns out that there was like 2 columns in that data set that are predictive of what they're trying to predict. And one of their, you know, human experts on whatever they're trying to model could have said, oh, you should probably start with these things. And it would have been on that list. And so, yeah, that's like, again, you can boil the ocean, you can go collect everything, talk to the humans, understand what they care about and start with that. Because usually people are experts in a field because they know what they're doing.
100%.
As Zach said, don't just dump it into the lake.
Yeah. Yeah, don't pollute the lake.
That's a swamp.
As far as design, I would say, like, if you find yourself in a spot where you all of a sudden have a lot of data silos, take a pause and reassess what you're doing. And by data, what is a data silo? A data silo can be like one person's collecting something in an Excel sheet in their laptop. That's a data silo. It could also be this organization or this part of a company is not really pushing all of their data into a main piece of database. You know, in manufacturing, data silos are machines, right? Someone who set up a machine is like, I only need to send it this metric and the part number and the timestamp, right? But there is a wealth of data in that thing that the rest of the company could use, and they're not sharing it. So if you're in that kind of position, or if you can't link something together, that's another bad one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're like, oh, we have all this useful data, and data over here can't be linked to data over here without doing some weird timestamp thing, right?
Yeah. I always like to ask people, how do you define customer? Because like everyone has a different definition in the same company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, I would say my advice is to always focus on the business, right? Like as much as the data is the fun stuff. Like if you're not driving the business forward, then it's all just science, which I have no problem with that. But, you know, I'm not a CEO, so, but I am a shareholder, so I care.
Another thing, note was treat your data like a product. You've got the product,
Yeah.
but then the data that is also an internal product,
Yeah.
which I thought was really valuable.
Yeah. You never know when you could, at some point down the road, if you have really good data strategy, you could make money off that data, right? That's how people ended up selling their data. Is someone turned around and said, "Hey, maybe another company wants to buy this data."
Yeah, look at
and we have
Nielsen.
it, so we can sell it.
Yeah, Nielsen, Bloomberg,
Yeah.
a lot of money off of data.
Yeah.
But even without that, though, like having the data strategy, I mean, it's a product strategy for your data. And it's really important to treat data as a first-class citizen of the business.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank our esteemed panelists. I want to thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much again, dear panelists and dear attendees, for attending this session. We have a lot more in store for today and the rest of the week. So here in this room, the next panel will be, do you believe in magic harnessing external wisdom for internal brilliance? If this is not what you're looking for, you will need to change the rooms, and our folks at registration desk will help you to find the right room for you. But if you're sticking around, you can stay here and have your QR codes ready for scanning. Lastly, for those who have your own startups or ventures, you will have a chance to showcase your venture on Friday. For this, please go and check open mic information at the welcome desk in the first floor lobby, and you can learn more. Last but not the least, we have a welcome party today at 6 p.m. I hope you can all join us and have some good music and drinks. Thank you very much. See you on the next panel.